Rachel had always lived on the edge of town, of society, of people's notice. Her small cottage sat a mile beyond the last row of clapboard houses in Dry Fork, separated by fences, fields, and unspoken distance. Her father had died 2 winters before, and though no one ever said it outright, most in town assumed she'd leave after the funeral. She didn't. Instead, Rachel stayed, planting vegetables, tending chickens, reading her father's worn Bible by candlelight, and speaking to no one unless spoken to. She was not unkind, just quiet, like the prairie winds that whispered through the cottonwoods. It was during one of those quiet days, as the sun tilted westward and shadows stretched across the dry earth, that Rachel went to the creek. The bucket was heavy in her hand, and the heat was pressing down hard. Grasshoppers clicked in the brush, birds hid from the swelter, and the water shimmered like a sheet of glass. She dipped the bucket, leaned back to stretch and froze. There, half hidden in the reeds, was a body. Her breath caught in her throat, a man, young, dark hair, tangled with leaves. His chest barely moved. Blood soaked his side, and he looked like he'd been running for miles, perhaps days. His skin, though sun-browned, was unmistakably Apache. For a long second, Rachel did not move. Every tale she'd ever heard as a child rose in her chest. Stories of savages, raids, men dragged from wagons. But the man before her was no monster. He was broken, dying, with eyes fluttering half shut like a wounded deer. A bullet hole in his side pulsed with blood, and his leg was torn. Perhaps from a fall. Rachel stepped closer, 1 foot at a time. "Can you hear me?" she asked softly. His eyes opened a sliver. He whispered something in a language she didn't know, then went still. She looked around. No one was nearby. No posses, no scouts, no townsfolk with rifles. Just her and a man everyone in town would call the enemy. And yet, she could not leave him. Rachel crouched beside him, heart pounding, and did what her father once taught her. Press cloth to wound. Keep the head up. Listen to the breathing. She ripped her apron, tied it tight around his middle, whispered, "Don't you die," though she wasn't sure he could hear. Then she stood, looked toward the town, then back toward her cabin. She couldn't carry him, but she had an old cart with wheels. If she moved fast. 10 minutes later, sweat pouring down her back, Rachel returned with the cart. The man hadn't moved. It took everything she had to roll him into it, his limp frame heavier than she expected. She threw her coat over his chest, covered him with a canvas sheet, and wheeled him up the dirt road like she was hauling firewood. No one saw her. Once home, she pulled him into the root cellar, a cool hidden place beneath the kitchen. There, she cleaned his wounds with boiled water and herbs, stitched what she could, and forced tiny spoonfuls of broth past his cracked lips. His fever burned for 3 days. Rachel slept beside the trapdoor, listening to him mutter in his sleep, sometimes in Apache, sometimes in words she didn't recognize. She told no one. He could barely sit up, but when his eyes opened on the 4th morning, and locked with hers, there was something ancient and powerful behind them. He didn't thank her, he didn't smile. He simply nodded. Once, Rachel nodded back. She didn't know who he was. She didn't ask, but something had changed the moment she chose not to walk away from that creek. It was no longer just about him, it was about her, about whether she would be the kind of person who turned her back, or the one who stepped forward, even when it cost her everything. And deep down, though she could not yet explain it, she knew this decision would echo beyond her little cabin, far beyond. In small towns like Dry Fork, silence was never empty. It was always listening, always watching. A stranger's shadow could fall on a window, and by dusk, the whole town would be murmuring about it over coffee and stew. So it was no surprise that Rachel's secret, her impossible act of mercy, didn't stay secret for long. It began with a boy. Young Caleb Tinker, son of the town's wheelwright, had wandered too far while chasing a rabbit through the brush near Rachel's cottage. He'd seen movement in the yard, Rachel hauling a bloodied cloth to the well and scrubbing fiercely with lye. She didn't see him, but he saw enough, a flash of red, a torn piece of buckskin, and Rachel, usually so still and composed, working with the frenzy of someone hiding something. Later that afternoon, Caleb told his mother, who told the seamstress, who whispered it to her husband, who worked at the general store. Within a day, Rachel's name passed through more mouths than bread or tobacco. She's hiding something, maybe a wounded outlaw. No, an Indian, it must be. The theory snowballed fast. Someone remembered Rachel buying extra cloth and vinegar at the store. Another claimed they saw strange footprints behind her house, barefoot. Wideset, Mr. Carson, the gravedigger, swore he heard muffled cries coming from the hill above her property when walking home late. It didn't take proof, it took suspicion. And that, Dry Fork had plenty of. The town held a meeting in the church that evening. It was not a trial, at least not officially, but it felt like one. The preacher stood stiff at the altar, calling for order and clarity while folks packed the pews with hushed voices and hard eyes. Sheriff Milburn, grizzled and tired, leaned on the rail with a hand on his revolver. "We got a report," he began, "that Miss Rachel Wainwright may be harboring someone." A few gasps, a few tight-lipped nods. "We intend to see whether it's true." A small delegation to deputies and the blacksmith rode out at first light the next morning. Rachel was in her garden when they arrived. She didn't run. She didn't lie. She didn't reach for the shotgun by her porch. She simply wiped her hands on her apron and looked them in the eye. "Yes," she said, "he was dying. I helped him." They demanded to see him. He was weak, barely conscious, lying under a blanket in her cellar. He didn't speak, only blinked. Slowly at the light, there was no weapon on him. No sign of danger. Just a broken, fevered man whose life had hung on a thread only days before. But to the men from Dry Fork, none of that mattered. "You understand what you've done?" the blacksmith asked, face red with disbelief. "That's an Apache. You've taken in an enemy." "I took in a human being," Rachel replied. "He would have died alone." They didn't argue. They didn't debate morality. They rode back. In silence, faces like carved stone, the town moved fast. That afternoon, the mayor who hadn't visited Rachel's farm in years stood before the townspeople and pronounced her a threat to their safety. Aiding the enemy, he declared, especially one who may have attacked settlers, is an act of betrayal. The crowd, already restless, leaned forward like dry brush waiting for flame. No one asked Rachel to speak for herself. By dusk, a resolution had been drawn up. Rachel was to be banished immediately. Her land would be seized by the town to prevent further risk, and anyone seen assisting her would face charges. They brought her into the square under escort. Her face was calm, but pale, not defiant, just tired. She looked around at people she'd grown up beside. The butcher who'd given her candies as a child. The teacher who used to sit beside her father in church. None of them would meet her eyes. The sheriff offered her a jug of water and a thin wool blanket. "You need to go, Rachel," he said. "Don't come back." She turned to him. "I saved a life," she said quietly. He didn't respond as the sun dipped behind the chapel steeple. Rachel stepped down the dusty main street with her belongings bundled under one arm and 1,000 unspoken truths heavy in her heart. The town had made its choice, but the earth was listening to. Rachel didn't look back as she left the town square, but she could feel their stares press against her shoulders like arrows. The sheriff had offered her a wagon to carry her things, but she declined it. What would she take? Her home was gone. Her roots had been yanked up from the dirt by the same people who once tipped their hats to her father. A satchel with some bread, a blanket, a flask of water, and the clothes on her back, that was all she carried. Behind her, the church bell rang 6 times. Evening, long shadows fell over Dry Fork as Rachel stepped beyond its borders for the last time. Dusk clung to her skirt as she walked the narrow path, leading away from the chapel and past the last house, Mrs. Winslow's cottage, its flower beds neat and bright, even in the dying light. Mrs. Winslow had once baked Rachel a pie when her father passed. Now she peeked out from behind a curtain, eyes wide but mouth shut. Not a single hand lifted to wave goodbye. Not a single word of comfort or farewell. Just silence. That silence was worse than hate. It said, "You're not one of us anymore." Outside of town, the terrain grew wilder, less managed, the fences fewer. The prairie stretched out before her like an ocean, of golden brown, the tall grass rustling with every breath of wind. Rachel's boots, worn and cracked, rubbed blisters into her feet as she walked. Her stomach rumbled, but she didn't stop to eat. The sun was sinking, and she needed shelter. It wasn't until she reached the old cottonwood tree by Black Hollow Creek, a place her father once took her to fish at, she allowed herself to rest. There, beneath its twisted roots, she sank to the ground and let out a long breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She wasn't afraid. She should have been. The wilderness beyond Dry Fork was vast and lawless. Coyotes hunted in packs. Rattlesnakes coiled beneath rocks. Sometimes outlaws passed through, hiding among the canyons. And yet, despite everything, Rachel felt strangely free. The fear she had expected, the panic of being alone, was missing. In its place was a bitter ache, yes, but also clarity. The weight of years spent living quietly under the rules of men who never truly saw her had lifted. The Apache warrior, he still lay in her cellar. Or perhaps he'd been taken, now, by the deputies. She didn't know what they'd done with him. Maybe they let him die. Maybe he escaped. The thought of him, his eyes, so alert and ancient despite his pain, came back to her again and again. As the stars blinked into the sky, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and watched the night descend. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying strange, distant sounds, the cry of an owl, the rustle of a rabbit darting through dry leaves, the distant howl of a lone coyote. The land was alive in a way the town never was. It did not care who she had helped. It did not brand her as traitor or saint. It simply watched, and Rachel, cold sore, heartbroken but resolute, watched back. She thought about her father, and how he always said that a person's worth wasn't measured by who they pleased, but by what they stood for when no one was watching. He would have understood what she did. Maybe he would have even done the same. That thought brought a flicker of warmth to her chest. Sleep didn't come easy. The ground was hard, her stomach empty, and the wind relentless. But still, she closed her eyes and whispered aloud, "I'd do it again." Her voice was soft but unwavering. And somewhere out there, though she didn't know it yet, her name was already on the wind, being carried across the plains, passed from fire to fire, tent to tent, a tale not of treason, but of courage, a tale that would call warriors to rise at dawn. But for now, Rachel lay beneath the stars, not knowing what would come, only that she had chosen to do what was right, and in a world as cruel as this, that was a kind of victory. Rachel woke before sunrise, her back stiff from the cold ground and her blanket damp with dew. A faint orange hue was beginning to brush the eastern horizon, and for a moment, she simply stared at it. The prairie was quiet, save for the occasional bird stirring in the brush and the whisper of wind sliding through the tall grass. It was a silence unlike the one in Dry Fork. This silence felt clean, honest. It didn't judge her or ask her to explain herself. It just was. She stretched her limbs, brushed off the dirt, and drank the last of her water. Her throat was parched and her stomach hollow, but her mind was clear. The pain of yesterday still hovered in her chest. How they looked at her like she was something spoiled or strange, but it didn't haunt her. Not anymore. The town was behind her now, and so was the need for approval. Rachel didn't know where to go next. She had no map, no plan, only the instinct to keep walking west, toward the rising wind and the untouched land. Her father once told her that if you followed the birds, you'd find water. If you followed the deer trails, you'd find shelter. And if you walked with your eyes open and your heart steady, the land itself would guide you. It sounded like poetry when he said it. Now, it was all she had. She walked for miles, her boots cutting paths through knee-high grass and dry patches of earth. Once she stopped to drink from a muddy creek, careful to cup the water and let the grit settle. She passed a circle of stones, once a fire pit. Long Cooldawn wondered who had sat there before her. A trapper, a scout, a warrior. Near midday, Rachel found the remnants of a hunting camp, bone stripped clean, a broken bowstring, and a few charcoal markings on a smooth, flat rock. The markings were unfamiliar, drawn in looping curves and sharp corners. Apache, she didn't know for sure, but something about them stilled her feet. She stood there a long time, one hand on the rock, as if trying to feel what the writer had felt when they made them. The sun was brutal. Her skin burned, her lips cracked. By the time she found shade beneath a spindly cedar tree, she could barely stand. She collapsed, grateful for a few moments of cool. Her thoughts wandered to the man she had helped, the wounded Apache. She didn't even know his name. He had never told her, and she had never asked. Still, she saw his face clearly in her mind. Sharp cheekbones, eyes like flint, the way his jaw tightened even in pain. Would he survive? Would he remember her? More importantly, would someone come for him? That was the question that had lingered in her chest since the moment she touched him beside the creek. She had saved his life, but did someone else value it enough to cross this brutal land and find her? She stood again, legs trembling. As she turned around the bend of a low hill, she stopped dead in her tracks. Fresh ones. Horse prints, wide and deep, cutting through the brush in a narrow formation, not made by settlers. These were riders who moved as one, the kind who rode with purpose and discipline. Her breath caught. The hoofprints were heading east toward Dry Fork. Or, more accurately, toward her. For a heartbeat, Rachel didn't move. Then, instinct took over. She dropped low, pressed her hand to the earth, felt the warmth still clinging to the indentations. Hours old, no more. Could they be Apache? Could they know? She didn't feel fear. Not exactly. More like awe. Whoever had left those tracks had passed not far from her camp. Had they seen her? Were they circling back? She looked up at the sky, the sun now lowering westward, casting long golden shadows across the land. They were coming, and she suddenly understood something she hadn't dared to believe. The choice she had made to save that man had not disappeared into the wilderness. It had echoed, carried like a drumbeat across the plains, and someone had heard it. The next morning came with no warning. Rachel had barely slept. Every rustle of leaves, every distant coyote call kept her eyes half open. The idea that someone had passed so close, so silently, haunted her. When the first rays of dawn spilled over the prairie, she was already sitting upright, back pressed against a twisted mesquite tree, hand resting on the cool leather strap of her satchel. Her limbs were stiff, her body exhausted, but her mind was sharper than it had been in days. The earth spoke before they arrived. It was subtle at first, a distant thrum, like the low hum of thunder trapped beneath the soil. Then the wind shifted. Birds flew up and scattered flocks from the dry canyons. A rabbit darted from a patch of brush, startled by something just beyond the next ridge. Rachel stood, slowly, and turned toward the eastern horizon. The light was golden, hazy. For a few moments, all was still. Then they appeared. Riders, than she could count, at first emerged from the ridgeline in silence, like ghosts born from the morning mist. Their horses moved in harmony, hooves striking the dirt with a rhythm older than any town. Not galloping, not charging, just moving, steadily, like they had been riding all night, with a purpose that could not be interrupted. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. They wore no uniforms, no banners, no colors of any nation and state. but she knew who they were, even before she saw the feathers, the braided hair, the scarred spears, and painted faces. Apache, not one, not a handful, but many. She counted a dozen, then 2 dozen, then more. They spread wide like the mouth of a river, riding with the solemnity of those who mourn, or those who come to judge. Rachel didn't run. There was nowhere to go. She stood straight, brushed the dust from her skirt, and waited. They did not shout, they made no threats. The first wave of riders slowed to a trot as they approached, fanning out to either side of her. Their eyes watched her carefully, not with hatred, but with something far more powerful: appraisal, memory, reverence. Then came the final rider, an older man, wrapped in a cloak of tan hide, feathers braided into his silver-streaked hair. He rode a black stallion that seemed to glide over the ground rather than walk. His face was lined with age, but his gaze was hard and bright. Rachel recognized him before he spoke. It was him, the wounded warrior she had saved. Alive. He dismounted, slowly, stiffly, favoring one side. He still bore the signs of his injuries, binding along his ribs, a slight tremble in his hand. But he stood tall. He walked toward her not as a man broken, but as one reborn. Rachel didn't know what to say. Her throat tightened. "You gave me water," he said, voice quiet but strong, when no one else would. "I couldn't leave you there," Rachel replied softly. "No one should die alone." The man nodded. Behind him, the riders dismounted, dozens of them spreading out in a quiet formation, not threatening, just present. Their presence said everything words could not. This wasn't a greeting, it was a gathering, a testimony, a judgment, not of punishment, but of witness. One by one, the warriors dropped to a knee. Rachel's heart stuttered. She stared as dozens of Apache warriors, fierce men with years of war in their eyes, bowed their heads before her. The earth held its breath. The sun climbed higher, casting light over the silent prairie. The old warrior stepped aside, and another approached, a woman, this time, elder and graceful, her face marked with ceremonial paint. She laid something on the ground before Rachel, a circle of woven grass, a symbol of peace, of welcome, of honor. "You did not see an enemy," she said in accented English. "You saw a man. You chose well." Rachel's eyes blurred. The weight of the past days, the pain of exile, the loneliness, all of it broke inside her. And what poured out wasn't sorrow. It was relief. She hadn't been wrong. She hadn't been alone. The sun climbed higher, warming the land. But Rachel stood frozen, as if caught between two worlds. In front of her knelt 100 Apache warriors, their heads bowed, not in submission, but in honor, a gesture that made her feel both humbled and entirely unworthy. These men and women had no reason to come, and yet here they were, their presence as profound as it was mysterious. The earth seemed to hush in their presence, as if recognizing the weight of what had just happened. Slowly, one by one, the warriors began to rise, but none turned away. They stood in a wide circle around Rachel, silent as stone, watching her, not to threaten, not to intimidate, but to understand her. The woman who had placed the woven grass ring stepped forward again and extended her hand. "Come," she said. "Our fire is not far." Rachel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She followed the woman on foot as 2 riders dismounted and brought their horses alongside her. One handed her a blanket, the other gave her a waterskin, eyes warm but unspeaking. They didn't offer words. They didn't need to. Their gestures were enough. The procession turned westward, moving in steady rhythm, like they had always known. This road, Rachel walked beside the woman and the old warrior she had saved, now, walking tall beside her, his pain masked beneath quiet dignity. No one spoke for a long time. The only sounds were the creak of leather saddles, the soft clop of hooves on dry dirt, and the wind combing through the grass. Eventually, they reached a rise that looked over a shallow valley. Nestled at its center was a small encampment, 7 lodges arranged in a loose ring, with a central fire already crackling to life. Children ran between tents, and old men tended to the flames. Women pounded maize or tanned hides, pausing only briefly as the procession arrived. No shouts, no alarm, no suspicion. Rachel had expected to feel like an outsider here, like a ghost walking into sacred ground. Instead, she felt something else: recognition. Not from them, but from the land, as if it had been waiting for her. They brought her to the central fire, where a buffalo robe was spread out beside a curved piece of driftwood set upright in the ground. The old woman gestured for her to sit. Rachel lowered herself carefully, her eyes sweeping across the gathering camp. She noticed how none of them watched her with mistrust, only curiosity. Quiet respect. The man she had saved sat across from her now, legs folded beneath him, eyes meeting hers in the glow of the firelight. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady. "My name is Tahani," he said. "I was chief to these warriors. I was meant to die near the river. I was ready, but you gave me life when I had none." Rachel didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. He continued, "There are those among us who say the world has turned, that the old ways will fade, and only pain remains. But the old spirits still speak, and they sent you." She shook her head. I'm just a girl from Dry Fork. They threw me out like a stray dog. Tahani's gaze sharpened. They cast you out for courage. For kindness they saw weakness. We see strength. From a nearby tent, another elder stepped forward and handed Tahani a small bundle wrapped in dyed leather. He unwrapped it with care, revealing a string of bone beads, their surface etched with tiny symbols. He leaned forward and placed it gently around Rachel's neck. This is not a gift, he said. It is a mark. That you are known. That your fire will not go out among us. The word struck something deep in Rachel's chest. For so long, she had been trying to survive alone, trying to cling to her father's memory, to do what was right in a world that seemed to punish it. And now, here, in a land of dust and warriors and ancient songs, she had been given something she never thought she'd find again. Belonging. Not because of where she came from, but because of what she chose. And in that moment, surrounded by the people whose lives she had touched without even knowing it, Rachel realized that exile had not ended her story, it had started it. That night, under a sky littered with stars, Rachel sat beside the central fire. Wrapped in a soft buffalo hide cloak someone had draped around her shoulders. The camp was quiet, but not in a way that felt empty. Children whispered in their tents. Elders murmured softly in words she couldn't yet understand, and the slow thump of a hand drum pulsed somewhere in the darkness. The flames before her danced like living spirits, crackling and snapping as if sharing stories only the old ones could decipher. Rachel didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence had already said everything. Tahani sat across from her. Again, his wounds now cleaned and bound properly, his face calm. Others had come to him earlier in the evening, young warriors, who had bowed slightly when they passed him, women who knelt to bring water or food. It was clear now, this man wasn't just any warrior. He was deeply respected, a leader, perhaps even a chief, and she had saved him. As the night deepened, one of the women who had first guided Rachel into camp approached with a bowl of stew thick with beans, game meat, and something earthy she couldn't name. Rachel accepted it with both hands and nodded her thanks, then sipped slowly. It was warm and filling, more nourishing than anything she'd eaten in days. After a while, one of the elders rose and began to speak in Apache. His voice was gravelly but strong, his hands moving in graceful gestures. Around the fire, heads turned toward him, some nodding, others watching with expressions of reverence. Though Rachel didn't know the words, she understood the rhythm, the tone, the way his voice carried memory, not just meaning. He speaks of ancestors. Tahani murmured, quietly translating beside her, of how they watch from the stars, of how sometimes they send messengers, people of strange paths who walk into our lives for reasons we do not yet understand. Rachel's eyes stayed on the speaker, but her chest tightened. Like me, she whispered. Tahani nodded once. Lie you. The fire snapped suddenly, sending a plume of sparks into the air. Rachel flinched, startled by how the wind shifted right then, brushing against her face like a breath. The drumbeat that had been steady all evening now changed lower, deeper, more intentional. One of the younger women began to hum, her voice low, almost a growl, joined moments later by a second voice, then a third. The rhythm took hold of the night. Rachel's body began to relax, lulled by the cadence, the flicker of firelight, and the way the camp seemed to blur at the edges. She leaned back against a rolled blanket and stared into the flames, her vision softening. The stars overhead shimmered brighter, and the ground beneath her seemed to pulse, not with fear, but with life. She wasn't sure when sleep overtook her, only that when it did, it wasn't a sleep filled with dreams of Dry Fork or banishment. Instead, she found herself standing in a wide open field under moonlight. In front of her stood an old woman cloaked in eagle feathers, eyes black as night, staff in one hand, smoke trailing from the other. Behind her, a river ran silver across the grasslands, and horses stood in silence, watching. You opened your hands, the old woman said in a voice like wind, and so the land opened to you. Rachel wanted to speak, to ask who she was, but the woman raised her hand. Kindness does not go unnoticed, and the land never forgets what blood it drinks. Then the dream faded. Rachel awoke with the first gray light of morning. Still wrapped in the cloak, the fire now smoldering low. Around her, the camp remained quiet, a few early risers moving, in slow rhythm, preparing for the day. But something was different. Tahani sat by the fire, already awake. He met her eyes and nodded. You dreamed, he said, like it was not a question. Rachel nodded slowly. A woman, feathers, she spoke to me. She is known, he said softly. You were seen. Rachel felt the weight of his words. She wasn't merely accepted here. She was woven into something older, something sacred. The land had marked her, not just because she saved a life, but because she had done so with no expectation of return. She had stepped into their now, it seemed, they had entered hers. Word traveled slowly on the frontier, but it traveled with conviction. By the third week, whispers began to drift across the prairie. They moved from campfire to saloon, from the lips of passing traders to the ears of fur trappers and ranch hands. The name Rachel Wince, only known in Dry Fork as a foolish, soft-hearted girl who defied the town's silence, was being spoken with a different tone now. A name not tied to shame, but to something far more dangerous. Honor. Some called it a miracle, others a warning. They said a girl had been cast out of her home for saving an old Apache, and by dawn, 100 warriors had come to kneel before her, not in revenge, but in reverence. They said she now lived among them, a girl with blue eyes and a sunburned face who walked between two worlds. They called her Ghost Sister, the one who stood alone. She who opened her hand depending on which tongue told the tale. In Dry Fork, people grew uneasy. The pastor who had condemned her now stood behind a pulpit that felt emptier by the day. Mrs. Henderson, who had told the church elders that Rachel shamed her kind, could not walk into the general store without feeling eyes on her back. Even Sheriff Mathis, who had refused to help when she pleaded for aid, started checking over his shoulder when riding alone past the edge of town, because every few days, riders were spotted on the distant hills, watching, not attacking, not speaking, just watching. They never came close. They never drew weapons. But their presence made men grip their rifles tighter and children stay inside longer. Because it wasn't just that they were Apache, it was that they were hers. Rachel didn't seek revenge. That thought never crossed her heart. Instead, she spent her days in the camp learning how to grind maize, how to braid yucca fibers, how to follow a trail by the bend of grass. She listened to stories told in firelight and began to understand the language through song and silence. Tahani became like a second father, teaching her not just how to survive, but how to live with the land rather than upon it. In time, the warriors let her ride with them first, behind one of the elders, then beside them, and finally alone. When she returned from her first solo scout across the plains, she was greeted not with cheers, but with nods of quiet pride. That was the way here. No one praised loudly. Respect was shown by trust. And trust Rachel had earned. One morning, she found a necklace laid on her bedroll, beads of bone and turquoise, arranged in a circle around a carved wooden feather. Tahani said nothing about it, but when she wore it, no one questioned her again. Children began to greet her openly. The women included her in the rituals before a hunt. And when a coyote's cry echoed near the camp one night, it was Rachel who the young ones looked to first. The girl who had once been cast out was now part of something older and deeper than she had ever known. Back in Dry Fork, a few people began to ask quieter questions. Old Man Dalton, who'd seen the riders with his spyglass, wondered aloud if maybe the girl hadn't done something worth remembering. Miss Clara, the schoolteacher, wrote a letter to her sister back east, describing a girl who might have changed the course of things. The mailman carried the letter, then told the tale at the next outpost. It traveled again, and again. Within a season, soldiers stationed near the New Mexico border began hearing strange stories. Officers scoffed until scouts began reporting riders traveling alone, leaving bundles of food near poor settler cabins, or helping lost children back to their farms. No tracks, no names, just the unmistakable signs of help left behind. Some said it was the Ghost Sister's doing. Some said she'd become a myth. But far out on the edge of the prairie, where the grasses rolled like waves and the wind sang through the cottonwoods, she was not a ghost. She was flesh and blood. She was Rachel, the girl who had once been cast out, and now stood tall in the circle of the people she'd once saved, not as a guest, that's one of their own,